Let me show you something. Right now, today, there is a video circulating online that is stopping people dead in their tracks. I mean that literally. People are watching it, pausing it, rewatching it frame by frame, and then sitting back in their chairs going, what am I actually looking at? Because what this trail camera captured, off-course entirely by accident in the middle of a remote stretch of old-growth forest, is something that by every accepted definition of modern science should not exist. And yet there it is, right there on the screen, in a quality that makes it nearly impossible to explain away. This is not a shaky, grainy, blink and you miss it blob filmed on a phone from 300 yards. This is not someone pointing a camera at a TV screen and saying, look at this. This is a trail cam, one of those motion-triggered wildlife cameras that hunters and hikers and field biologists leave out in the deep woods for weeks or even months at a time. And what it caught has divided the entire internet into two very loud, very passionate camps. Some people say it is the clearest, most undeniable footage of a Bigfoot ever recorded. Others say it has to be a hoax, a guy in a suit, or a bear caught at an unusual angle. But here's the thing, the more I've looked at this footage, and I've looked at it a lot, the more I've broken it down frame by frame, the more I've compared it to every other piece of supposed Bigfoot evidence I've ever seen, the more I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. I don't think this is a hoax. I don't think this is a bear. And I'm going to walk you through exactly why, piece by piece, because this deserves a serious, careful conversation rather than a quick dismissal or breathless hype. Both of those do the footage a disservice. Let's start with the context, or rather the conspicuous absence of context. This clip surfaced online without a name, without coordinates, without any backstory attached. No caption, no explanation, no post describing the circumstances of the discovery. Just the raw footage dropped quietly into a handful of Bigfoot research forums and outdoor communities, and then it absolutely exploded from there. Within days, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times across platforms. Wildlife researchers were forwarding it to each other. Mainstream media outlets were picking it up. And still, nothing. No one came forward to claim it. I've been through every comment section, every thread, every repost I can find, and there's been zero confirmation of who set this camera up, who retrieved the footage, or where exactly in the world this forest is. Some people say that makes the whole thing suspicious. I genuinely understand that reaction. But when I think about it from the opposite direction, if you're a regular person, a hunter, or a hiker who accidentally captured something like this on a camera you set up to check deer movement, would you want your name attached to it? Would you want strangers showing up at your property? Would you want to be followed through your daily life by people demanding answers you don't have? I genuinely think the anonymity makes sense here. It fits a pattern we've seen repeatedly in legitimate wildlife encounters and in the broader history of Bigfoot evidence. People share what they saw, but they protect themselves in the process. The wilderness doesn't care about your social media presence, and sometimes neither does the person who is lucky or unlucky enough to capture something truly extraordinary on camera. What I find significant is the reaction from within the research community. When something is a hoax, the people who've spent years studying the subject are usually the first to spot it and say so clearly. They've seen every trick. They know what cheap suits look like on camera. They know the tells. And the researchers who've looked most carefully at this footage have been unusually quiet in their skepticism. That measured, careful response from experienced eyes is itself a kind of data point. Okay, let me walk you through the footage itself because this is the heart of everything. The clip is approximately 10 seconds long, but there is so much packed into those 10 seconds that I could genuinely spend an hour unpacking it. The camera appears to be mounted at roughly chest height on a tree trunk. angled slightly outward to cover a natural trail or game corridor running through the forest. The environment around it is dense, green, and unmistakably alive. Thick layers of undergrowth, ferns, brush piled waist-high in places, tall conifers, and deciduous trees pressing in from every direction, creating that cathedral-like canopy that you only find in old-growth forest. The footage has that characteristic look of older trail camera recordings. Slightly grainy, slightly washed, with that particular quality that film era or early digital outdoor cameras produce. That aesthetic is immediately familiar to anyone who has spent time reviewing wildlife cam footage from the field. It's not cinematic, it's not produced. It looks exactly like what it is supposed to be. A camera doing its job alone in the wilderness, day after day, recording whatever happens to cross its field of view. And then Bigfoot walks into frame. There is no dramatic buildup. One moment the trail through the undergrowth is empty and still. The next, there is this enormous, upright, entirely fur-covered figure moving through the shot from left to right. It walks on two legs with a fluid, unhurried stride. Not lumbering, not stumbling, not the awkward shuffle you'd expect from a person in a bulky costume trying to navigate dense, uneven forest terrain. It moves the way something moves when it belongs in that environment, like it has walked this exact ground 1,000 times before. The figure is tall, substantially taller than what you'd expect from a human being, even a very large one. The proportions are immediately striking from the moment it enters the frame. The shoulders are exceptionally wide. The arms are long, hanging lower than a human's would, swaying with each step in a pattern that is deeply familiar to anyone who has studied primate locomotion. The entire body is covered in dark brown hair. Not a uniform, flat, costume-like covering, but textured, layered, catching the dappled forest light differently across different parts of the body as it moves. And then comes the moment that is all anyone is talking about. Bigfoot turns its head, not its whole body, just its head. It rotates deliberately and smoothly and looks directly back over its right shoulder toward the camera. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, you can see the profile of the face, the pronounced brow ridge, the relatively flat facial structure, the width of the skull. And then it simply continues walking, completely unbothered, stepping through the undergrowth and disappearing behind a large tree on the right side of the frame. Gone, as quietly and naturally as it arrived. That head turn is the detail I keep returning to above everything else, because it is not alarmed, it is not fleeing, it does not startle or stumble. It glances back the way you might glance back if you sensed something behind you on a walk through the woods, acknowledging the presence with a look that is curious, aware, and calm. It is the behavior of something that understood it was being observed and simply did not find that to be an emergency. That specific behavioral register that controlled awareness is one of the most striking elements in the entire clip. When you slow this footage down and go through it with real attention, several things become impossible to ignore. The first and most immediately striking is the gait. Human beings walk with a very specific biomechanical pattern. The way our hips rotate to produce forward momentum, the way our arms swing in a cross-body counterbalance, the rhythm of our stride length relative to our height. What is in this footage does not walk like a human being. The stride is longer and lower to the ground. The arm swing is more pronounced and originates from the shoulder differently. There's a slight forward lean through the torso that is consistent with how great apes move when they walk bipedally, and deeply inconsistent with normal human walking mechanics. The second major element is the movement of the hair and the suggestion of muscle mass beneath it. As Bigfoot moves through the frame, you can see the coat shift and ripple over what appears to be very significant physical mass, particularly through the upper back, the shoulders, and the upper arms. That kind of organic, layered movement is extraordinarily difficult to replicate with any prosthetic or costume technology. If someone was wearing a suit in this footage, the engineering required to achieve that level of realistic, natural body mass movement would be remarkable. And it would have been produced for what? To drop an anonymous clip on the internet with no name attached and nothing to gain from it? The third element that stands out in frame-by-frame analysis is how Bigfoot navigates the undergrowth. It doesn't fight the forest. It doesn't step around obstacles with the exaggerated caution of someone trying not to trip in a bulky costume. It moves through the brush with a practiced, fluid ease, stepping over root systems, pushing through low branches without breaking stride, reading the terrain the way a wild animal does when it has spent years developing an intimate familiarity with its environment. Compare this to any known costume-based hoax footage and the difference in environmental fluency becomes immediately obvious. Then there's height. Based on the tree trunks, the undergrowth, and the surrounding vegetation visible in frame, researchers who have analyzed this footage independently have estimated the figure's height at somewhere between 7 and 8.5 feet. A very tall person in an elevated costume can get you close to the lower end of that range, but the proportions still would not be right. The arm length relative to the torso, the shoulder width relative to the hips, the head size relative to the body. All of these measurements together describe something that does not fit cleanly into any category of costumed human being or known North American wildlife. What I find most compelling is what Bigfoot does not do in this footage. It does not look around nervously or scan for observers the way a person playing a role tends to do. It does not stumble or adjust its balance awkwardly as someone in a restrictive costume inevitably does. It does not react to the camera with the exaggerated movements of a performance. It simply moves through the space, confidently, unhurriedly, with an ease of motion that speaks to an animal completely at home in its environment. That absence of performance is perhaps the hardest quality to fake and one of the most important things about this footage. Nobody has confirmed the location of this footage, but I've spent considerable time analyzing the environmental clues visible in the frame, and I have some strong working theories. The vegetation visible in the clip tells a story if you know how to read it. The combination of dense, deciduous, and mixed conifer growth, the specific layering of that undergrowth, the moisture visible in the texture of the forest floor, the quality of the light filtering through the canopy. All of it points strongly toward the Pacific Northwest of North America. We're talking Oregon, Washington State, or the border regions of Northern California. The Pacific Northwest is and has always been the historic heartland of Bigfoot territory. The Cascade Range, the Olympic Peninsula, the vast stretches of old-growth forest that stretch from the coast up into the mountains and then continue into the interior. This region has produced more credible Sasquatch reports, more physical evidence, and more compelling witness accounts than anywhere else on the continent. The terrain is perfectly suited to support a large, elusive primate species, enormous and largely uncharted wilderness, low human population density through the interior, and an ecosystem rich enough to theoretically sustain a viable breeding population of large omnivores. A second strong candidate is the interior forests of British Columbia and Alberta in Canada. Northern British Columbia in particular contains some of the most remote, least explored temperate rainforest on the entire continent. There are thousands of square miles up there where a trail camera could sit for months without any human being getting within 10 miles of it. The sightings from that region have been consistent and well documented across generations. both from indigenous communities whose oral histories describe these encounters and from more recent accounts by hunters, loggers, and backcountry travelers. There's also the possibility, less obvious but worth taking seriously, that this footage was captured somewhere in the Appalachian corridor, eastern forests, particularly in West Virginia, Tennessee, the Western Carolinas, or the remote stretches of upstate New York, have a long and surprisingly robust history of Bigfoot encounters that get substantially overshadowed by the Pacific Northwest narrative. The density and darkness of old-growth Appalachian forest can look remarkably similar to Northwest old-growth when captured on a trail camera, particularly in summer when the canopy is fully closed. Bigfoot sightings from the Appalachian region go back centuries, documented in settler journals, indigenous accounts, and a steady stream of modern reports that never quite make it into mainstream conversation. If this footage is from the Pacific Northwest, and the evidence I've seen points in that direction, then it is simply the latest chapter in an extraordinary history of encounters stretching back further than written records go. Long before anyone used the word Bigfoot, the indigenous peoples of this region were describing encounters with massive, upright, hair-covered beings in the deep forests. The Lummi, the Salish, the Klallam, the Chinook, the Haida, all of these cultures had names for these creatures, specific names that carried specific meaning. And all of them treated them not as mythological inventions or symbolic metaphors, but as real, physical beings that shared the wilderness with their communities. The modern era of documented sightings really ignited in 1967, when Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin came back from Bluff Creek in Northern California with what became the most analyzed piece of cryptid footage in history. The Patterson-Gimlin film has now been subjected to decades of forensic analysis, biomechanical study, computer enhancement, and repeated attempts at replication by professional costume designers and Hollywood special effects specialists. None of those attempts have succeeded in definitively proving it was a human in a suit. The figure in that film, apparently a female Bigfoot walking along a sandbar, shares several striking characteristics with the figure we see in this new trail cam footage. In the years and decades since, the sightings have continued with a consistency that is hard to explain if Bigfoot doesn't exist. In the forest around Mount St. Helens in Washington state, hikers and park rangers have reported massive bipedal figures moving through the tree line at dusk, on a regular basis for decades. In the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, multiple independent witnesses across multiple decades have described the same basic experience: enormous prints in the mud far from any road, an overwhelming smell of something wild and animal, and just barely visible shapes moving between the trees with a speed and silence that seems impossible for something of that size. One particular account that resonates strongly with this new footage involved a wildlife biologist working in the Olympic National Forest in the late 1990s. Setting up a network of trail cameras to monitor black bear movement through a particular drainage, the researcher returned weeks later to find something on one of the cards that had nothing to do with bears. Multiple frames on multiple nights showed an upright figure, large, hair-covered, moving through the same trail corridor in the dark. The researcher shared the images quietly within the wildlife biology community, but declined to go public with them, worried, understandably, about the professional consequences of associating their work with Bigfoot research. Sound familiar? If the British Columbia theory is correct, then we're looking at territory where Bigfoot sightings have been so consistent and so credible that some First Nations communities have been publicly advocating for legal species protection for years. The Sitsails First Nation, whose traditional territory sits in the Fraser Valley east of Vancouver, regard Sasquatch, known to them as Saskets, as a flesh and blood reality rather than a legend. Elders speak of encounters passed across generations not as supernatural stories but as natural history. These are not people who confuse reality with myth. One of the most striking and consistent threads running through Bigfoot folklore across every culture that has ever documented these creatures is how deeply private they appear to be. Not aggressive toward humans in most accounts, not predatory, simply and profoundly committed to a life lived at the very edges of human observation. The folklore, across dozens of different cultural traditions spanning thousands of miles, describes Bigfoot as an intelligent being that has made a long-term, sustained choice to live at the absolute periphery of the human world. Close enough to observe us, distant enough to disappear. Indigenous accounts from across North America describe Bigfoot as a being that watches more than it acts. Hunters in remote areas have described the feeling of being observed from the tree line for hours before catching the briefest glimpse of something retreating silently into the forest. Hikers have woken in their tents to the sounds of something enormous moving in the darkness around their campsite, and then found in the morning the evidence of that presence, but not a single act of interference. Bigfoot, according to the oldest and most consistent stories, does not come to harm. It comes to observe. This footage, that slow and deliberate glance back at the camera, fits perfectly into that behavioral tradition. The Cherokee spoke of the Sul Kalu, a slant-eyed giant of the mountain forests, as a powerful being with deep ties to the wild places. The Lakota described similar beings as guardians of wilderness territories. The Ojibwe spoke of the Wendigo in its most ancient form as something vast and unseen moving through the boreal forests. The Coast Salish had Saskets, the Lummi had Semekwes. Across hundreds of different cultural traditions covering enormous geographic spans, the core description remains remarkably consistent. Large, upright, hair-covered, solitary, intelligent, and supernaturally skilled at remaining unseen. What strikes me every time I look at the most credible Bigfoot accounts is how consistently the creatures described are portrayed as aware. Not animal aware in the instinctive sense, but situationally, strategically aware in ways that suggest higher order cognition. They circle campsites without approaching them. They parallel hikers on trails without being seen. They investigate trail cameras, as this footage appears to show, with what looks like deliberate curiosity rather than random movement. The folklore encoded this understanding long before modern researchers began discussing it. Many of the older accounts include something else worth noting: descriptions of Bigfoot communicating, not in human language, but in a way that clearly carried intentional meaning. Organized patterns of sound, stick structures left in specific configurations, stones arranged in ways that seem deliberate rather than natural. Researchers who take the subject seriously have been documenting these apparent communication behaviors for decades. And the picture that emerges is of a species with far more sophisticated cognitive and social architecture than the wild ape, framing that popular culture tends to apply. If Bigfoot is real, why has no one ever found a body? This is the question, always the question. And it genuinely deserves a serious, considered answer rather than a dismissal or a deflection. On the surface, it seems like the most devastating argument against the existence of these creatures. We have found the fossilized remains of animals that lived millions of years ago. We find the bones of large mammals in remote wilderness every year. Why, in centuries of human exploration of North American forests, have we never found a Bigfoot carcass? Why no skull? Why no bones? Why nothing? Let's start with ecology, because the ecology is actually the most important part of this answer. In temperate, old-growth forest, the kind of dense, moist, microbe-rich environment we appear to be looking at in this footage, a large carcass can be comprehensively consumed and decomposed within a matter of weeks. Scavengers, insects, bacteria, moisture, and the remarkable efficiency of forest floor ecology work in concert to reduce organic material to nothing with startling speed. Mountain lion remains, elk carcasses, even the bodies of large black bears have been documented going from intact to unrecoverable scattered fragments in as little as 4 to 6 weeks under optimal decomposition conditions. If Bigfoot dies in remote locations, and by definition these creatures spend their lives in the most remote locations available, there may simply be nothing left to find by the time any human being comes close enough to look. There's also an increasingly serious theory emerging in the research community about Bigfoot behavior around death. Many highly intelligent animal species exhibit complex behaviors related to their dead. Elephants have been documented returning to the bones of deceased family members years after death, spending hours or days with the remains. Chimpanzees and gorillas have been observed staying with deceased group members for extended periods and exhibiting behaviors that researchers describe as grief. If Bigfoot, as an apparently intelligent, apparently socially organized species, has any form of relationship with its dead, then the remains of these creatures might be in locations deliberately chosen, remote, and potentially maintained in ways that make them unlikely to be encountered accidentally. And then there is the issue of sheer scale. People underestimate the size of North American wilderness constantly and dramatically. The Pacific Northwest alone, just the designated wilderness areas, just the national forest roadless zones, not counting the vast stretches of unprotected and largely unvisited interior, covers an area comparable to several European countries combined. We have not searched it. We do not search it in any meaningful, systematic way. Vast stretches of that landscape have not been visited by a human being in living memory. The assumption that we would have found every large animal that ever died in those forests is not supported by any realistic understanding of the geographic scale involved. Now here's where I want to pause and point out something about this footage that I haven't fully addressed yet. Something that I've been sitting with carefully because it shifts the entire frame of what we're looking at here. Go back and watch the clip one more time. Watch Bigfoot not just as it exits the frame, but as it enters and moves through the shot. Watch the whole arc of its transit, because there's something subtle happening that's easy to overlook the first time, something that becomes very hard to unsee once you notice it. Bigfoot's pace slows as it passes the camera, not dramatically, not to a stop, but there is a perceptible reduction in stride speed as the figure moves through the zone directly in front of the lens. Combined with the deliberate head turn, this creates a behavioral sequence that looks less like a random encounter and more like a purposeful acknowledgement, like something that detected the camera's presence, made a decision to get a better look at it, and then continued on its way without treating the discovery as a threat. That behavioral reading aligns with something researchers have documented across decades of serious Bigfoot investigation. These creatures appear to demonstrate spatial memory and environmental awareness that goes well beyond instinct-level animal behavior. They seem to know their territories in granular detail. They track changes within those territories. They notice things that are out of place. If a Bigfoot has been using this particular forest corridor as part of a regular route, which given the apparent comfort level in this footage seems entirely plausible, then a trail camera mounted to a tree that wasn't there before would absolutely register as something novel, something worth a look. This is not the behavioral signature of an animal running on pure instinct. This is the behavioral signature of something that thinks, something that processes new information and responds to it with measured, considered action. And that cognitive element, more than the size, more than the hair, more than the gait or the proportions, is what stays with me long after the footage ends. Because if Bigfoot is aware enough to notice a trail camera, to examine it, to glance back at it while calmly continuing on its way, then Bigfoot has been aware of us, tracking our movements, registering our presence, understanding our technology for a very long time. And it has simply chosen to remain invisible. Think about what that means. Think about the absolute mastery of concealment that would require across a population of large animals, across centuries of increasing human encroachment, across the exponential expansion of human technology and surveillance capability. We have satellites that can read license plates from orbit. We have hundreds of thousands of trail cameras deployed across North American forests every hunting season. We have camera-equipped drones, dash cams, doorbell cameras, wildlife research stations. And still, in all of that, we get glimpses, fragmentary, ambiguous, controversial glimpses. That level of sustained concealment, if it is deliberate, represents a cognitive achievement that we should find as extraordinary as the physical reality of the creature itself. Here is something that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations: the institutional problem. The reason we don't have definitive scientific answers about Bigfoot is not only because evidence is scarce, it's also because the academic and scientific establishment has made it effectively career-ending to seriously pursue this question. Biologists, zoologists, wildlife researchers, anyone working within an institution that cares about funding and peer review and professional reputation knows better than to attach their name to a serious Bigfoot investigation. The social cost is immediate and substantial. This creates a catch-22 that has plagued serious research into this subject for decades. The scientific investigation needed to either confirm or definitively disprove the existence of Bigfoot requires resources, technology, and institutional support. But institutions will not provide that support without prior credible scientific evidence, and that prior evidence cannot be obtained without institutional support. The funding gap is as responsible as anything else for the current state of the evidence base. What we do have working around the edges of that institutional barrier is a community of independent researchers who have been doing remarkably rigorous work for years, collecting hair samples, casting footprints, cataloging sightings, building geographic databases of encounter patterns, all without university affiliation, government funding, or mainstream scientific credibility. Some of the physical evidence this community has gathered is genuinely compelling. Hair samples analyzed by forensic labs have repeatedly returned results that DNA databases cannot confidently match to any known species. Footprint casts from multiple independent sites show anatomical consistencies. Dermal ridge patterns, pressure distribution, mid-tarsal break signatures. That would be extraordinarily difficult to replicate systematically across dozens of separate supposed hoaxes over many decades in multiple geographic regions. The genetic evidence is perhaps the most tantalizing frontier. A study published in the mid-2000s by a team of researchers analyzing hair samples attributed to Bigfoot from multiple locations found mitochondrial DNA sequences that did not match any species in existing databases. The research was quietly filed away rather than published in a major journal because no one wanted to be the institution associated with a Bigfoot paper. That kind of quiet suppression of inconvenient data, not through conspiracy, but through the mundane operation of institutional risk management, has characterized the scientific treatment of the subject for the better part of a century. I've been in contact with several people in the Bigfoot research community about this footage, and the response has been genuinely notable. The researchers who've spent years, in some cases the better part of their careers. Studying this phenomenon or reacting to this clip differently than they typically respond to viral Bigfoot content. There's a quality of careful, sustained attention to it that I haven't encountered in a while. Not the excitement that usually greets a new piece of possible evidence. Something more like the cautious recognition of something that looks, finally, like it might be the real thing. One researcher with a background in wildlife biology who has been studying Bigfoot evidence for over 15 years, and who has asked, understandably, not to be named, told me something that stuck with me. When analyzing movement patterns in wildlife and wildlife-adjacent footage, one of the most reliable indicators of a hoax is what she calls performance energy. The subtle, often unconscious ways that a human body moves differently when it knows it is being observed, when it is executing a planned sequence of movements rather than simply existing in space. Shoulders carry tension slightly differently. Timing becomes slightly artificial. There is a quality to intentional movement that is almost always detectable to a trained eye, even when it's being very carefully concealed. Her assessment of this footage was that it contains none of those performance signatures. The movement throughout the clip is completely unself-conscious. There is no trace of choreography, no hint of someone executing a planned sequence of steps for a camera. Whatever is walking through that forest is not putting on a show. It is simply moving through a space it knows, doing what it does, attending to whatever it needs to attend to in the normal course of its day in the forest. She would not go on record calling it definitively Bigfoot, but she also would not dismiss it. From someone of her experience and credibility, that measured refusal to rule it out carries significant weight. The skeptical analyses that have circulated alongside this footage have been worth engaging with seriously, because a few of them raise legitimate methodological points. The most credible skeptical concern focuses on scale. Without a known reference object in the frame, precise height estimation becomes genuinely difficult, and all the other proportion-based analysis becomes harder to pin down. That is a fair point and worth acknowledging. But here's where it breaks down as a complete explanation. Scale ambiguity might account for one anomaly in the footage. It doesn't account for the gait. It doesn't account for the hair movement. It doesn't account for the behavioral sequence of the head turn. You cannot explain all of those elements away with a single objection about camera angle. I've been watching Bigfoot evidence for years. I've seen the viral clips that turned out to be bears caught at unusual angles. I've seen the obvious costume footage where the seams are practically visible. I've seen the thermal imaging that's always just ambiguous enough to be completely inconclusive. I've seen the blurry photo that gets enhanced into either a Sasquatch face or a patch of dark bark, depending on who's doing the enhancing. And I've seen the very small handful of clips, genuinely a small handful, that give me real, sustained pause, that make me sit with the discomfort of not knowing. This footage belongs firmly in that second category. Part of what makes it feel genuinely different from the noise is the accidental nature of the capture. This trail camera was not set up by a Bigfoot researcher. It wasn't placed in a known hotspot by someone who had studied the literature and chosen a location strategically. It was placed by someone doing something completely ordinary, monitoring deer movement, checking a hunting spot, doing the thing that thousands of people across North America do every single year. The camera's positioning, its height on the tree, its angle of coverage, none of it suggests a setup designed to capture this specific subject. Bigfoot simply walked through the one place in a vast forest where a recording device happened to be running. There is also something important in what the footage does not give you. Good hoaxes tend to be generous in a specific way. They give you just enough of the costume to fuel the argument, just enough detail to keep people talking, just enough clarity that you can see the thing but still argue about what it is. This footage doesn't do that. Bigfoot is partially obscured by vegetation for portions of its transit through the frame. The lighting is uneven and imperfect in the way that real forest lighting always is. The grain of the film means that close analysis yields more texture but not necessarily more clinical clarity. All of that reads to me as authentic trail cam footage rather than a staged production. And then there is the detail I keep returning to above all others, the relationship between the figure and the ground. Watch how Bigfoot's feet contact the forest floor. There is a weight behind each footfall, a physical reality to each step that the surrounding vegetation and soil respond to. That would require either a genuinely enormous person in a very specifically engineered weighted costume, or an actual large animal moving across actual terrain. In trail cam footage recorded in soft forest soil and root systems, mass cannot be easily faked. The ground responds to what's actually on it. Let's sit with the possibility for a real moment, because if this footage is genuine, if what walked through that trail camera's field of view on that ordinary day in a remote forest is actually Bigfoot, then the implications reach far beyond the Bigfoot research community, not just for cryptozoology, for ecology, for evolutionary biology. For our understanding of what kinds of intelligent life have been sharing this continent with us for the entirety of recorded human history in North America. It would mean that right now, today, a population of large, apparently intelligent, bipedal primates is living in North American forests, moving through the same wilderness areas where people go hunting and camping and hiking every weekend. Not in legend, not in folklore, in the physical world, in real time, occupying actual geographic space. And it would mean that this population has maintained its existence, has survived, reproduced, thrived sufficiently to produce multiple generations. In a world of rapidly expanding human presence, advancing surveillance technology, and the relentless documentation of the natural world that characterizes the modern era. That last element is the one I genuinely cannot get past, and I think it's the most important. We are living in an era of extraordinary technological visibility. Trail cameras alone have fundamentally transformed wildlife research. Herds, packs, and individual animals that were almost never directly observed have been documented with stunning detail and regularity by cameras that never sleep and never get tired of waiting. Game camera networks across North American forests have captured footage of mountain lions, wolverines, fishers, wolves, and countless other elusive species in their natural behavior. In this environment, something enormous has continued to be found only in fragments, glimpses, the occasional contested clip. If that sustained invisibility is the result of active, intelligent concealment, if Bigfoot is not failing to be seen but actively choosing not to be, then we are dealing with a level of cognitive sophistication and adaptive behavior that places these creatures in a category entirely their own. And the quiet, calm, aware glance that the figure in this footage directs back at the trail camera before continuing on its way becomes, in that context, something more than a behavioral curiosity. It becomes a glimpse into a mind that knows exactly what a camera is. That has probably seen cameras before. That recognizes the moment of being recorded and responds with nothing more than a measured, unhurried look before disappearing back into the forest it calls home. The folklore got this right, I think, across every culture that ever tried to make sense of these encounters. The oldest accounts do not describe Bigfoot as a monster. They describe something that watches from the deep shadows of the forest, present, intelligent, ancient, and deeply committed to a life lived beyond the reach of human scrutiny. And every so often, accidentally, something like a trail camera catches a glimpse. Not because Bigfoot made a mistake, but because even the most careful beings in the world cannot account for every possibility in an infinite forest. Go watch this footage, watch it full screen in the best quality you can find, and watch it more than once. Watch the way Bigfoot moves through that undergrowth. Watch the arm swing, the stride, the way the body navigates the terrain. Watch the head turn. Watch the calm, deliberate quality of that backward glance, and then ask yourself honestly whether you have a better explanation. Because I've been looking for one carefully and seriously since the first time I watched this clip, and I am still looking. The honest answer, the answer I keep arriving at no matter how many times I go through the analysis, is that this footage is unlike anything I have seen in years of following the subject. It has the right qualities in the right combination, the right physical proportions, the right gait mechanics, the right behavioral signature, the right quality of environmental interaction, the right absence of performance energy. Each of these elements taken individually might be dismissible. All of them together in 10 seconds of footage from an anonymous trail camera in the middle of nowhere is something else entirely. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm not asking you to accept Bigfoot as established scientific fact on the basis of one clip. What I'm asking is that you look at this footage with the same careful, open attention that you'd bring to any genuinely unusual piece of evidence, and that you resist the reflexive dismissal that our culture has conditioned us to apply to this subject. Because that reflexive dismissal has a cost. It's the reason we've been having this conversation in circles for 70 years. And the forest doesn't care whether we're convinced or not. Whatever is in it keeps moving regardless. Think about what it would mean for the way we understand this continent's natural history. North America is not a fully mapped, fully understood ecosystem. We discover new species of mammals, birds, and reptiles every year. Mostly small, mostly in remote habitats, but consistently. The idea that a large primate has evaded classification is unusual, but not biologically absurd. The okapi, a relative of the giraffe the size of a horse, was considered a legend by Western science until 1901. The giant squid existed only in sailors' folklore and washed up carcasses until the first live footage was captured in 2004. The coelacanth, a fish scientists believed had been extinct for 65 million years, turned up alive and well off the coast of South Africa in 1938. Science has a consistent and humbling track record of being surprised by what is living in the parts of the world it hasn't looked at carefully enough. The North American interior, particularly the Pacific Northwest, the boreal forests of Canada, the deep Appalachian ranges, represent some of the least systematically studied wilderness on Earth. We have mapped it from above. We have road accessed its edges. We have surveyed its perimeters. But the deep interior of the largest forest systems on this continent remains as unexplored in any practical day-to-day sense as it has ever been. A viable population of large, elusive, intelligent primates living in that interior is not a biological impossibility. It is an uncomfortable possibility that the scientific establishment has chosen largely not to investigate. Whatever this is, whatever walked through that forest on that unremarkable day and glanced back at a camera mounted on a tree, it is out there right now, in the same forests that line the highways you drive, in the same mountains where you take the kids camping in summer. Moving quietly through terrain it knows better than we know our own backyards, living a life completely parallel to ours, sharing a continent that most of us have no real awareness we're sharing with anything like this. And every so often, not often, never often, it walks past a trail camera. And the footage makes it to the internet. And the arguments start all over again. And somewhere, deep in a forest that hasn't seen a human footprint in months, something large and hair-covered and unhurried continues walking. Unbothered, aware, belonging entirely to a world we only think we understand. For more interesting stories, check this out.